So I'm Paula Stein-Clark. I'm the leader of the League of Women Voters, Dakota County. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this Public Issues Forum on gun violence in America. Before we get started, I want to pause and recognize that today we are observing Veterans Day. So many of the things about tonight's forum are possible because of the men and women who served our country and fought to preserve what it stands for, including, but not limited to, freedom to speak, freedom to disagree, civil discourse on public policy, the Second Amendment right to bear arms, freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, and the role of we the people in government. If we have any veterans, any reservists, any active duty service members from any branch of the military in our audience tonight, could I ask you to stand for just a moment? Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for your service, and we appreciate you being here tonight. So the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. The League does not support or oppose any party, nor do we endorse any candidates. The League does, however, take positions on the issues after study and consensus of our members. We invite you to join us through membership, volunteerism, activism, advocacy, participation in events and programs as you are tonight. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or in whatever way feels comfortable for you at this stage of your life. We have a table in the lobby that gives you some more information about League, and the back of your program includes information as well. We also have Minnesota voter registration forms at our table, so we invite anybody who either needs to update your registration or is perhaps not currently registered to please register to vote if you haven't already done so. That said, tonight's forum is not about the League's position. Rather, this forum is intended as a vehicle to build awareness and greater public understanding of the various positions on this issue, and really to advance the public discourse. The opinions expressed here tonight are those of our speakers, not the League, and the agenda for tonight's forum is printed in your program. Gun violence in America is part of the daily public conversation, and we know that it is a topic filled with emotion, that most people have strong opinions about the right solutions. We know our members are deeply interested in this topic, and by your presence here tonight, we see that it's important to you too. Let it be said that we believe everyone wants to reduce gun violence. But where we perhaps diverge is in our various perspectives on how to do that. So that's the position that we're coming from tonight in having this conversation. The League has a long tradition of hosting public issues forums, bringing subject matter experts on important public policy topics to you in a nonpartisan, moderated way. We pride ourselves on civil discourse, on talking about important and sometimes controversial and difficult topics in a respectful, civil, and educated way. We ask that you honor that tradition tonight as you participate fully in tonight's event. We ask that you remain quiet and respectful tonight without reacting positively or negatively to the information presented or the panelists' remarks. We are here to listen to each other and to get to as many questions as possible from the audience, and that is only possible if we don't have lots of interruptions. Please hold your applause until the conclusion of the event. We appreciate your cooperation with these standards. I also have to do my due diligence as the leader here in Dakota County and ask for your monetary support of events such as these. This event is free and open to the public, and we're so happy to see all of you who have turned out, but it is not free to produce. If you value these opportunities for public forums, we encourage you to contribute what you can to the League here in Dakota County. On our table out in the lobby, we have a free will offering box. Whether it's $1, $5, $10, whatever you feel like you'd like to contribute, we would generously appreciate that. Your donations make it possible to bring programs like this close to you right here in Dakota County. We would also like to thank Nativity Episcopal Church for allowing us to host this forum in their sacred space, and our moderator, speakers, and panelists for being part of this event. Thank you guys so much for being here and for your support. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please take a moment now, if you haven't already done so, take a moment to silence your cell phone so we don't get interrupted with that. The forum, as you can see, is being video recorded, and it will air primarily through our website. So we'll make sure that that video feed should go up within probably a week or so. We'll get it edited and up. The restrooms are located outside of the sanctuary, through the registration area, through the gathering space. Just follow the signs, leave breadcrumbs and follow the signs. But they are down the hall, and there are some signs that mark the location of the restroom. So please take care of yourself if you need to during the course of the forum. Questions for our panelists will be done in writing. Some questions were received in advance. For anybody who saw our publicity, we invited people to send questions to our email box. If you have a question now or at any point throughout the program, please raise your hand, and one of our ushers will come to you with a question card and a pen. When your question's ready, simply flag down an usher, and they'll take it over to our question facilitators, which is this group of ladies sitting back here who are trained in the league standards on how we evaluate questions. Due to time constraints and the sheer volume of questions that we anticipate, including those that we got in advance, we know we will not get to all questions that are submitted. Our forum will end at 8:30 p.m. To help us stay on time, we are aided by 2 timekeepers here in the front row, and they will be using timing paddles. So if you see things going up in the front, there are no signs with nasty things on them. Why don't you just kind of hold up a sign so people can see what they are? They just basically say 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, stop, so that people know when they are coming up on the end of their response time. So we've asked all of our speakers and panelists to try to abide by those time limits whenever possible. That helps us stay on time. All right. So those are housekeeping items. To get us started, I'm happy to introduce you to Emily Helgeson. She's a member of the League of Women Voters, Dakota County, and our lead organizer for tonight's event. She'll provide you some facts and figures to help frame our panel discussion. Please help me welcome Emily. Your top
where's the clicker? There we go. Well, welcome again, everyone, to the Gun Violence Public Forum. This is obviously a hotly debated topic in politics, the media, social media, and even worldwide. Because it is such a large topic, we aren't able to cover all aspects with regard to gun laws, types of gun violence, nor any demographic debates. However, we hope that you find the approach that we have taken for the forum to be engaging and informational. So the reason we are doing this presentation is to make sure that we all have a base level understanding of gun violence statistics in America. For the purposes of this presentation, we have defined gun violence to mean gun suicides and homicides only. So when looking for the statistics, we made it our goal that the information was unbiased, relevant, and the best available. The base level data for the graphics came from the sources listed here. And one caveat to keep in mind is that there are nuances of definitions that can drive variances in reporting. However, the general trends and concepts should hold. So I've packed a lot of information in a small amount of time, so here we go. To conceptually start tackling the topic, I wanted to first provide an understanding of the level of gun ownership in America. So we are by far a top civilian gun-owning country with about 90 guns per 100 residents. This translates to an actual number of guns of 270 million civilian-owned guns in America, which account for 48% of the estimated 650 million civilian-owned guns worldwide. So now to get into our topic. So the rate of gun deaths in America is higher than any other high-income country in both gun suicides, which is the first bar, and gun homicides, which are the second bars. Something to note is that the rate of gun suicides in each country outpaces the rate of homicides. While the numbers show that Americans' proclivity to commit suicide and homicide with a gun is higher than other high-income countries, I also wanted to put that in perspective of the total rate of suicides and homicides. So though Americans tend to use guns when committing suicide, that doesn't appear to be driving a higher rate of total suicides when compared to the rest of the world. So as you can see, Americans fall within the 10 to 14.9 suicides per 100,000 people, and that's similar to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Scandinavia, and a lot of Central Europe. So now let's take a look at homicides. So compared to these 4 representative Western countries, America has a higher total rate of homicides and also a higher rate when broken down by gun homicides and homicides by other means. So the red bar represents the gun homicides, and the blue bar represents the other means. So this trend of a higher homicide rate than other countries has been in place since 1950. So here's a historical homicide trend chart for the same selected countries. The U.S. homicide rate is the top bar, and it started increasing in the 60s and 70s and has been in a general decline since 1980 when it peaked. So this is a similar trend in Canada and Australia. Let's expand the homicide rate to the rest of the world. So while America's homicide rate is higher than other Western countries, it still ranks in a lower tier when compared to the rest of the world, falling within 3.0 to 4.9 homicides per 100,000 people. So let's turn our focus to specifically the American statistics. So from 1993 to 2014, the gun homicide rate halved from 7 to 3.4, while the gun suicide rate remained relatively stable. Something to note is that during the same time frame, non-fatal violent firearms over-halved. So these values represent the average rate for the entire country, but that only tells half the story. So here's the concentration of gun homicides by county. The darker the red, the higher the level of gun homicides. The darker the blue, the lower the level of gun homicides, and the white areas had low enough gun homicides to not be reported. So as you can see, there are certain areas in America that are driving our higher gun homicide rates. So I found an interesting interactive chart that showed 50 cities' homicide trends. The black line represents the average of the 50 cities' homicide trend. So the average rate in the 80s started at over 20 homicides per 100,000 people. And in 2015, it ended at just over 10 homicides per 100,000 people. So the decline in homicides has continued. So let's look at the raw numbers. So total gun deaths in America is over 30,000 in 2015. This number consists of 61% suicides and 36% homicides, or about 13,000 total homicides in the year. So as we have already seen that though gun suicides are higher in America, total suicides are in line with the rest of the Western world. But since our homicide rate is higher, let's continue to focus on the gun homicide number, which again is around 13,000 per year in a country that owns about 270 million civilian guns. So on average, 70% of all homicides in America are committed using a gun. Of those, 68% are committed using a handgun. So within homicides, there is a high level of media attention around mass shootings. So let's start breaking down homicides by number of victims per incident through categories of multiple, active shooting, and ultimately mass shooting. So 90.6% of all homicides are single victim situations, with the remaining 9.4% falling into the multiple victim category. Keep in mind that multiple does not mean mass shooting. Multiple is defined as 2 or more. So in 2014, there were 1,129 multiple victim situations. The FBI studied 160 specific types of active shooter incidences between 2000 and 2013. This is defined as an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. Of those, the vast majority were done in businesses and schools, which represent 70% of the total active shooting incidences. So now we finally arrived at mass shootings. Before January 2013, mass shooting was defined as 4 or more fatalities per incident. However, in January 2013, President Obama changed the definition to mean 3 or more fatalities. So the chart below reflects the variance between counting 4 or more and 3 or more. So the number of mass shootings and fatalities seems to be somewhat stable between 1982 to 2010. From 2010, the number of incidents and fatalities seemed to be rising. However, in 2017, there were a total of 11 incidences, and 6 of these had only 3 fatalities and would not have been included in the historical definition of mass shootings. So let's put all of this data in a complete view of gun violence in America. So from 2001 to 2013, suicides accounted for 60% of all gun deaths. Homicides accounted for 38.4%, and within that figure, mass shootings represented 0.075% of total deaths. So we have now talked a lot about the gun violence numbers. Let's pivot to gun laws. So I've taken our previous historical homicide trend chart and overlaid some key federal gun legislation policies. The green boxes represent an increase in gun restrictions. The yellow is a mix of tightening and loosening of gun restrictions, and red is a loosening of restrictions. So in 1968, the Gun Control Act increased restrictions on buying and selling guns. And then in 1986, the Firearm Protections Act loosened some of those previous restrictions, but also banned the sale of automatic weapons to civilians. In 1990, the Crime Control Act enacted gun-free zones in schools. In 1994, the Assault Weapons Ban Act was passed, keeping in mind that 60% of gun homicides use handguns. And in 2004, the assault weapons ban was allowed to expire. So what can be concluded from this information? So I pulled 4 research studies from 3 different institutions that looked at evidence for the effects of gun policies on gun violence. And I also included 1 study that specifically looked at Australia. Each study had a similar conclusion. Quoting, "We found little persuasive evidence for the effects of most policies on most outcomes." So as Australia is often referenced as an example of effective gun policy, let's take a closer look at their gun violence. Australia introduced mandatory gun buyback program. So here's a chart showing the trend of gun-related deaths in Australia by suicides, which is the yellow-orangish line, and by homicides, which is the blue line. So both appear to be declining since 1980. Suicides at a faster rate with regards to mass shootings, something that's noted a lot about Australia is in the 15 years prior to the first gun buyback program in 1996, there had been 13 mass shootings in Australia. However, in the 21 years since the first gun buyback program, there has not been a mass shooting in the country. So let's now take a look at the Australian gun suicides and gun homicides in perspective of total suicides and homicides by all means. So despite the fact that gun suicides have been in decline since the 1980s, it appears that total suicides have remained relatively stable, with the majority of people using other means to commit suicide. When it comes to homicides, total homicides by all means have been declining since 1988, and gun homicides have been declining since 1984, somewhere around there. So it is worth noting that the majority of homicides in Australia are committed through other means, as well as the majority of firearms used to commit homicide in Australia since 1989-1990 were held unlawfully at the time. So this concludes the statistics section of our public forum event. I hope that this information has expanded your general understanding of gun violence and will be a useful point of reference during the panel discussion.
Thank you, Emily. They're going to do a quick change of mics here. As Emily mentioned, the slides with those source citations, which I know she went through really, really fast, and they might have been hard to see from your seats, but those will be available on our website. So look for those, and you'll be able to, if you want to, do some further digging and investigation into those citations. So next, I'd like to introduce to you Sergeant David Powers from the Burnsville Police Department. And he's going to provide a little bit more localized statistics. So you saw a lot about the United States across our country, as well as some international comparisons, but Sergeant Powers is going to talk a little bit more about localized statistics and information about local gun laws. David has been in law enforcement for 21 years and is a retired volunteer firefighter that has served in his community, the community in which he lives, for 20 years. His current assignment is as the City of Burnsville's Emergency Management Coordinator. During his law enforcement career, David has served in patrol, crisis negotiations, field training officer, crime scene team, mobile command post, and crisis intervention team. I think he's probably done everything in the department, it sounds like. So please help me welcome Sergeant Dave Powers.
All right, thank you. Like Paula said, we're just going to go over a little bit of Burnsville. This is going to be the kind of the agenda that I'm going to run off of. I'm just going to do some Burnsville stats specifically. What I do, I'm also in charge of approving or denying permit to purchase applications for firearms in the city. I'm going to touch on that and our process. I'm going to look at the basics of the permit to carry, though those are processed through Dakota County Sheriff's Office, and then the gun transfer in the state of Minnesota. As with any good presentation, I have a disclaimer there. So I'm just up here to provide some basic facts. I'm not trying to take any sides. I'm trying to be a kind of the middle of the road type of person. So that's the disclaimer that an attorney wrote. So just to let you know. I'll be honest, I didn't write it. So statistics in Burnsville. Through basically 1013 through 1018, permits to purchase totaled 2,662. Out of those 75 of those were approved and denied 87 of those. We only have statistics that go back 5 years because that's the retention policy for gun permits or gun permits to purchase. Burnsville statistics related to the use of a firearm. For a 10-year period, we have 7 homicides within the city, and then we have 6 injuries with a firearm in those all 10 years. So getting into the permit to purchase application process. Basically, a person has to apply in person. We use the Minnesota Uniform Firearm Application and Receipt permit application. That's a standardized form that is actually maintained by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Applications, like I said, are dropped off at our police department. They're verified for accuracy. And then a receipt is also given because there is a time frame in which we have to process these. Again, through the uniform application, the applicant signs that they are not the subject of any of the disqualifiers, which I'll have a couple slides here coming up to kind of show you what they're looking at when they do apply for a permit to purchase. And any falsification of the permit or the application, will be a reason for denial. Basically, after it gets turned in, our records department runs all the applicable checks. Applicable checks. That includes criminal history, driver's license inquiries, contacting any of the police departments in which the applicant lived in within the past 5 years. And then we also contact the Department of Human Services as well. There's another check for that. Once all this information is obtained, a permit is actually printed. Just found it easier to do that than have the application go back multiple times. So they don't get a chance to have it in their hand if they get denied. I just want to let you know that. So then it actually, I'll just touch base on what the application looks like. These are some of the disqualifiers under the state and federal laws in which the applicant is actually signing off that they are not subject of. And there is also a second page. So they do actually have to sign that, and through our checks, we can verify all these things here. So once everything is done, the complete application comes back to me. Each application, if it's a very short one, everybody is, or that applicant is doing well, could take up to 10 to 15 minutes. For some of the more complex ones, they could take up to 60 to 90 minutes each. So it is a very intensive process. The more complex the application, the longer it is. And because that has to go through, like I said, the criminal history process check, or me to review that, possibly contacting the applicant for further documentation, also contacting state, local, county, or other state agencies to get reports, obtain reports, and read those. County courts in various counties, not just the local county. And again, contacting the Department of Human Services if they have any other sort of documentation for them or the applicant. And also, in some cases, contacting immigration officials for residency. So why is this all done? It's basically to make sure some of the states obviously write their different laws, or write laws that are similar in nature to the state of Minnesota. But they vary in wording, and we have to apply it to the Minnesota laws and see how it varies, and see if that is ultimately a determination of disqualification under the state or federal law. Basically, the two things that I use for the determination of eligibility under laws is Minnesota State Statute and Federal Statute. What I find common disqualifiers are felony convictions or domestic assault convictions. Again, if I can't make that determination, or if there's just something I'm not sure about, I always err on the side of caution, and again, involve our city attorney, who then reviews the application and determines eligibility, or assists me in determining that eligibility. So the final part of the process is the approval or denial. Once everything's done, if they're approved, the permit is signed, returned to our records department, and then it is mailed out or picked up by the applicant. If they are denied, a denial letter is completed and mailed to the applicant. And again, all applications are retained based on our retention policy. So just the basics on permit to carry. They are processed through the Dakota County Sheriff's Office. You must be 21 years of age. You must have received training per the statute within 1 year of the application. Again, successfully pass the required background check and not be prohibited from firearm possession. Basically, what I'm looking at during the permit to purchase review is what they're looking at to approve or deny a carry permit. The permit also works as a permit to purchase, and under Minnesota state law, there is no stipulation on a firearm being concealed if they are granted a permit to carry. Gun transfer laws. I'm just going to sum this up due to time. Basically, if we get the question, how do I transfer a firearm to another party? I refer them to a federal firearms dealer of their choice and encourage them to go to complete that transfer, just to make sure that the buyer is eligible to possess a firearm. That concludes my presentation. And my contact information is up there if needed.
Thank you, Sergeant Powers. All right. Thank you for that valuable information. Sergeant Powers is going to rejoin us later in the program, so if you have any questions for him about anything that you saw, please flag down an usher, write out your question, and we'll get those questions to him. So he'll join us later for the community question and answer section. We are in the process, or we're going to be doing a very quick set change here, because our panelists don't want to sit with a screen between the audience and themselves. So bear with us while we do a little bit of moving. All right, so now that that screen is out of the way, I invite our panelists to please come up and take your seat at your name. Oops. We'll just pause for a second, let everybody get situated. And hopefully everybody has what they need. So again, if you've got any questions, feel free to flag down an usher. All right, to guide us through the next parts of our program, I want to introduce our moderator, Mary Rice. Mary is an attorney from Bloomington. She's also a league-trained moderator and currently president of the League of Women Voters Bloomington. She will be following the forum format and rules as previously agreed to by our panelists. So please help me welcome Mary Rice. You're all mic'd up.
All right, thank you, Paula. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Dakota County for inviting me to moderate tonight's forum. I look forward to the discussion. First of all, I will introduce the panelists. Steve Drazkowski is the Republican representative for Minnesota House District 21B, which includes portions of Dodge, Goodhue, Wabasha, and Winona counties in the southeastern part of the state. Bryan Strawser is chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus. The Reverend Nancy Nord Bence is the executive director of Protect Minnesota. And Representative Erin Maye Quade is the outgoing DFL representative for Minnesota House District 57A, which includes precincts in Apple Valley and Lakeville. Please find more biographical information about each of our panelists in your program. We'll begin with the panel discussion portion of our program with opening statements. Each panelist will have time to give an opening statement, and the speaker order is determined by me. Each panelist will have 90 seconds, and we will begin with Steve. I want to say that before this program began, each panelist gave permission to use their first name, so that's what I'll do. One panelist offered even to let me use their nickname, but I won't. So we'll stick with first names. All right, we will start with Steve.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, my nickname is Draz. They call me at the Capitol, too. So I'd like to be fairly informal. Steve Drazkowski. I represent House District 21B in southeast Minnesota. I've been in the legislature now for 11 years. I currently serve as chair of the Property Tax Committee in the House. And of course, that's going to be changing as we are going to be having a change in leadership in the Minnesota House for the next 2 years. My background, I grew up on a farm and live in Mazeppa in western Wabasha County. Was a firearm safety instructor for a number of years with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and an active person who actively hunts, shoots, and enjoys firearms.
Bryan?
Steve and I have to share a mic, so when you're doing that with the state rep, it's hard to tell how much of the time I'll get the mic. I'm Bryan Strawser, chairman of the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus and Political Action Committee, a role I've held since October 2013. We're an independent state-level gun rights group. We're not part of the NRA or another national organization. We don't take any marching orders from gun manufacturers or the NRA or any other national group. And I'm a volunteer. I've devoted thousands of hours over the last 10 years to this particular cause in building the organizations that we have here today, and I know many of our members are here as well. I grew up in rural Indiana. I've been in Minnesota for 13 years. I came here for work, met my wife. She's a native, so you know that means I'll never leave. But when it comes to firearms, I grew up around firearms. I worked in law enforcement prior to a private sector career. I'm an NRA instructor, which means I teach or have taught firearm safety classes. I'm a Minnesota permit to carry instructor and a chief range safety officer, meaning I understand how to design ranges from a safety standpoint. And we'll get into the discussion today, but obviously my position is that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms for the purposes of self-defense, not for hunting or other reasons. And I hope as we talk through today that we can get off of our typical gun control and gun rights talking points and talk more about how do we actually address the issue of violence involving firearms here in Minnesota and across the country. Thank you.
Nancy.
Hi, I'm Reverend Nancy Nord Bence. I'm the Executive Director of Protect Minnesota. We are an independent, state-based gun violence organization not affiliated with any national group. Our mission is to promote a culture of health and safety for all Minnesotans by preventing gun violence. We've heard some great statistics about national stuff, but I'm going to use my time to share some of the statistics about gun violence and gun death in Minnesota specifically. In Minnesota, 2 to 3 people are shot every day, and at least 1 dies of their injuries. According to the Minnesota Department of Health, in 2016, which is the last year for which data are available, there were over 900 shootings and 432 gun deaths in our state. 432, that compares to 376 opioid deaths and 392 traffic fatalities. Suicides account for nearly 80% of Minnesota's gun deaths, homicides for 20%. The majority of gun deaths in Minnesota take place in greater Minnesota, including 63% of gun suicides. 71% of gun homicides take place in the Twin Cities. One last statistic, between 2006 and 2016, total gun deaths increased 32% in Minnesota, and crimes permitted with guns increased 60% in Minneapolis. And so amongst all this bad news, those are some of the statistics that we find most worrisome.
Erin.
Thank you. I'm State Representative Erin Maye Quade. I represent 57A, which is Apple Valley, and the northeast portion of Lakeville. I'm here tonight for one simple reason, and it's this. This is not a debate. This has been asked and answered. 90% of Minnesotans support background checks on all gun sales. 87% of Minnesotans support red flag laws, and the numbers go down a little bit from there, but they don't really go below 60. These are common sense gun laws that don't infringe on the rights of lawful abiding gun owners, and these are the things that Minnesotans have been marching and rallying and sitting in and walking out for years, but especially in the last 2 years, as we have seen gun violence increase in our nation, and we have seen it increase in our state. So I am sitting here tonight to represent those 90% of Minnesotans who support those laws, because these are the things that we agree on. If you asked 9 out of 10 Minnesotans what the weather is like outside, I don't think you'd get 9 out of 10 saying the same thing. If Minnesotans agree this much on these things, these are laws that we could be passing as a state legislature. I sat in at the state legislature because of the inaction that we were having, and I know that this new class of folks who are going in are going to take action because Minnesotans are demanding it. I'm glad to be here with you tonight to talk about gun violence and how we can decrease it, but it does start with guns. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. For our panel discussion, the League of Women Voters Dakota County put forward 4 questions which the panelists received in advance of this event. Each panelist will have 1.5 minutes to answer each question. The speaker order is determined by me. Our timekeepers will hold up signs to indicate when you have 30 seconds remaining, 15 seconds remaining, and when you must stop. So let's move on to our first question, and the first to respond will be Nancy. I'm going to ask it now. Okay, here's the question. Should gun suicides and gun homicides be treated equally with regards to proposed solutions for gun violence?
Well, I don't know what you mean by equally. If you're asking, should gun suicides and gun homicides be viewed as equally tragic events, I would say yes. Both gun suicides and gun homicides involve loss of life and have long-term negative impacts resulting in ongoing trauma for families and communities. And if you question that, ask any first responder or medical professional or police officer or clergy person or funeral director who's had to deal with the aftermath of either incident. There are, of course, obvious differences. Gun homicide is treated as a criminal offense triggering response from law enforcement, and gun suicide is categorized as a mental health problem. But when we ask the public health question, how do we prevent these incidents instead of just reacting to them, then gun suicide and gun homicide begin to look much more alike. Both have at their foundation what public health professionals call diseases of despair: historical trauma, depression, alcohol and drug abuse, hopelessness, and both can be best prevented by intervening early, and in both cases, it is absolutely essential to remove guns from those most at risk. And so we really strongly believe that the laws that do that best are the laws that will help for both, and that would be requiring permits to purchase on all gun sales, passing extreme risk protection orders, and keeping strong child access protection laws.
Thank you. Erin?
So I'll mirror a little bit of that. I'm not sure what equally means, but I will say that when it falls under the category of gun violence, they haven't been treated the exact same, but legislation that has been put forth does address both. So gun violence restraining orders or extreme risk protective orders, which allows law enforcement or family members to petition a court to say this person with a gun might be dangerous to themselves or others, would address both gun violence and gun suicide. We know that red flag laws could have prevented a number of mass shootings in our nation, and that law enforcement does not have the opportunity to use a tool to go in and remove lethal weapons from someone who might be dangerous to themselves or others. And then we can also look at the fact that the United States doesn't have lower, shall we say, rates of suicide, but we do have higher rates of gun suicides. And so we can look at all the issues we have surrounding mental health and know that gun suicide is complete and immediate. And most people who attempt to complete suicide, if they survive, 70 to 80% never attempt again. Gun is the most immediate way to end a life. And so when we look at rates of mental illness, we look at rates of suicide, we know that gun is the most immediate and the most impactful, and reducing those could certainly address suicide in our state and in our nation.
Thank you. Bryan?
Thank you. So I think I'm going to take an opposing view. I think, in brief, no. I think the public policy issues here are different. I would view these questions in this way. How do we work to prevent individuals from killing each other in a criminal homicide? And how do we work to help individuals who are facing a crisis so that they don't choose to commit suicide? What resources can we connect them with to do that? We believe the solutions for preventing and reducing homicide could include things like proper sentencing for violent offenders, reintegration programs when you're coming off of that sentence, early intervention programs, particularly for at-risk youth, and reforming our probation laws here in Minnesota, which are an outlier in the United States in the level of severity they are, and the individuals that we choose to focus on instead of focusing on violent offenders. Particularly, we do this with low-level offenders, and that keeps us from devoting the right resources for supervised relief and probation to the right offenders in terms of risk and violence. Solutions for suicide include expanding access to mental health care, early intervention, which has been mentioned. I think educating families to understand the risk factors and where they can go to obtain help, and training to spot early warning signs, particularly in K through 12 schools and colleges, so that they can help obtain resources for their students and their loved ones. We've been a part of an effort here with firearm retailers and others to help folks spot individuals who are at risk for suicide. Those programs have been voluntary and have been widely supported by the firearms industry. I think these are quite different issues with very different public policy solutions.
Steve.
Well, first of all, I read this question. It says, I'll read the question. Should gun suicides and gun homicides be treated equally with regard to proposed solutions for gun violence? And as I read the question, I think if you took the gun out of this loaded question and then began to find the answer at that point, that might be a better approach. The question should read, should suicides and homicides be treated equally with regard to solutions for violence around guns or caused by guns or methods of guns? We could easily reword the question to say, should suicides by poisoning and homicides by poisoning be treated equally with regards to proposed solution for poisoning? Or should suicides by automobiles or should suicides by suffocation with regard to proposed solutions for automobiles or suffocation violence? It would be the same thing. So we're just looking at a particular method that is used by somebody who either commits suicide or commits harm to someone else. Regardless of the means by which suicide or homicide is accomplished, are they both bad? Yes, they're both bad. Regardless by the means which suicide or homicide is accomplished, do they end in the same result? Yes. They generally end in the same result, regardless of the method or the means. We need to get to the cause of the violence towards oneself and others embodied in these two destructive behaviors instead of focusing on the objects or methods used to accomplish them.
All right, we'll now have 5 minutes of panel discussion on this same question, giving time for clarification, response, and rebuttal. My role is to help ensure that the time is balanced. If one panelist is dominating the conversation, I'll interrupt you. The forum timers will signal when 1 minute remains, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, and then when the panel discussion must stop. So, who would like to begin? Erin?
Thank you. I'd like to respond to my colleague with respect. And so I love that you brought up the issue of poisoning, because we actually do regulate poison, so we don't have suicides or homicides. And the reason is because it's deadly and lethal. But I want to go back to the Sergeant Powers presentation, which was actually very helpful. We got all of this information about permit to purchase, permit to carry, and listening to all of that, you would think, well, wow. Every gun that is purchased in Minnesota goes through this very extensive process, and that is wonderful. 85% of guns purchased in Minnesota go through that process. 15% of guns sold in Minnesota happen through private person-to-person sales. A 14-year-old in the state of Minnesota can buy a rifle or a handgun without permission from their parents, without a background check. These are the places that we are talking about. When we talk about reducing access to lethal things like poison or guns, we want to make sure that every person who purchases something lethal, like poison or guns, goes through a background check to assure that they can have that thing. And so when we're talking about all of these statistics, what we leave out are these large majority of guns that are part of criminal actions or suicide, and we're not talking about the whole picture. And so I wanted to make sure we bring it back to a lot of guns go through this process, which is why a lot of gun owners feel like more things are onerous, because they do go through these processes. Most people do that. There are 15% of Minnesotans who own guns who do not do that. And so when we're talking about removing the word gun from this issue, we don't need to remove the word gun, because gun violence and gun suicide and gun homicide are very specific. They're different than knife violence and knife homicide and knife suicide. Knives are used for different things. Guns are used for killing. And if we are going to put killing objects in the hands of people, we should make sure that the person who is having that very precious thing is able to have it, so that they are not killing themselves or other people. I think that's very important.
Does somebody else have a comment?
Yeah, I found that discussion kind of interesting, because actually if you look at the things used for suicides in Minnesota, this is in the U.S., firearms are the #1 leading use of a method for suicide among men. Among women, and poisoning is the #1 use for suicide. Both of them kill people. Both of them are undesirable. Both of them are regulated, and we are not doing ourselves a good service if we don't properly address the problem. We're missing the boat if we stick around with this really haplophobic approach that we're seeing in our culture, where people are, by the way, haplophobia, folks, is the fear of firearms or the fear of people who own, possess, or know how to use properly firearms. And so focusing on firearms and demeaning them out of our own fear and misunderstanding for them will not get us where we need to get with both of these things, with both suicide and with homicide. The reality is, and you looked at the numbers on the chart, you looked at the Asian countries and the amount of people that commit suicide and homicides in those countries dwarfs what we have here. And so many of those countries, they have like zero tolerance for guns in their country. So what do? They use these other things. So the reality is, we're not addressing the problem if we stay fixated on one of these particular methods, because there's laws against killing yourself or killing someone else with poisoning, pushing them over a cliff, burning them with fire, or any other thing. And that's the reality that I see. Thank you.
Is there another comment?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Just wanted to respond to Representative Maye Quade. So it is illegal for a person under the age of 16 to possess a firearm unless they're in the presence of a parent or guardian. It's illegal for the 14-year-old to purchase a firearm, even on private sale, and it is a felony under both state and federal law for an individual to sell a firearm to a 14-year-old. I don't know that passing a universal background check law would change that situation, because it's already illegal for that transaction to occur.
I would like to be able to speak a little bit about the efficacy of different suicide means. The most important thing when someone is feeling suicidal is to limit access to lethal means, and especially the more lethal the means. So guns are 82.5%, I hate to use the word effective, at completing suicide. All other forms of suicide together are about 4% effective. So it's really important, if someone is feeling suicidal, that we make sure that they don't have access to the thing that will kill them the most effectively. Many, many people, as Erin said, do attempt suicide. They survive the attempt, they get the help that they need, and then they go on to not die of suicide. 90% of people who attempt suicide do not die of suicide eventually. So we have to make sure that we're removing the means from the people that are the most deadly, and that is, by all means, guns. And to say that taking some pills is the same as putting a gun in your mouth and shooting through your brain is just a fallacy.
All right. Thank you. Question number 2. On this question, the first person to respond will be Bryan. In your opinion, what are the most effective solutions to gun violence in America? Which solutions are legislative and which are not?
Thank you for the question. So as an organization, we don't believe, and I don't personally believe, that gun control is the solution to violence involving firearms. And I think the data tells that tale. Rather than focusing on gun control, let's talk about some actual bipartisan solutions that we can get done this year. Because if we stay focused on this narrative of gun control and gun rights in a split legislature, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. And we're going to spend the next 7 months arguing over the issue of guns rather than trying to go after the actual underlying issue that we're going after. We have a gap in Minnesota where our processes involving domestic violence conviction and restraining orders about removing firearms from those individuals that have been convicted and prohibited from possession. I think it was KSTP that did a story on the fact the law says one thing, many police departments are not following that law, so there's probably a legislative fix to work on there. We should look hard at sentencing and probation reform from the standpoint that I think as we look at what's effective, and we did this with drug offenses a few years back, but we should look at how we sentence individuals, prohibited persons found in possession of a firearm, individuals who commit violent crime with firearms, individuals who are on probation and supervised release with firearms, should be more intensive in terms of sentencing and supervision than what we do for nonviolent offenders. We should look hard at using accepted threat assessment teams and processes in K through 12 schools and colleges, and we should look at how we teach firearms safety in public health classes in K through 12 schools alongside other public health concerns that we talk through. Thank you.
Nancy.
So between 1946 and 2016, the U.S. managed to cut the rate of motor vehicle death in America by nearly 90%, and we didn't confiscate cars. In fact, there are more than 10 times as many cars on the road now as there were in 1946. We did it by treating motor vehicle deaths as a public health problem and then applying public health solutions, research, legislation, litigation, and education. We could do the same thing with gun violence and dramatically reduce the rate of gun death in this country. Unfortunately, Minnesota state law still prohibits the Minnesota Department of Health from collecting data it needs to do basic public health research on gun violence, and majority leadership at the Capitol has blocked every attempt to pass even the most provenly effective legislation, universal criminal background checks, and extreme risk prevention orders. On a federal level, we need Congress to repeal the law that gives gun manufacturers sweeping immunity from litigation. If we could sue the pants off the gun manufacturers the way Ralph Nader did the car companies, then gun manufacturers would end up having to compete to make the safest products, the way Ford and Chevy do now. And then finally, education. We need a massive friends don't let friends drive drunk kind of education campaign about gun violence. Because until we can convince ordinary Americans that guns do not make us safer, we will not achieve any of our other goals.
Thank you. Steve.
As could be seen from the presentation, we saw what gun control efforts have done to stem both homicides and suicides in the past. They've been ineffective. They've had no success at accomplishing, and I think we need to take note. It's obvious that many Second Amendment restrictions have been placed in the United States Code and Minnesota statutes so far have achieved absolutely nothing to reduce violence with guns or with any other objects or methods. Sick people and bad people continue to use guns, opioids, ropes, cars, bombs, knives, gases, fire, gravity, water, and other things to carry out violence against themselves or others. Current infringement on the Second Amendment rights of nonviolent people are actually increasing gun-related homicides. Gun-free zones can get people killed. We need to have the ability for law-abiding people to be able to protect themselves and others when a madman or madwoman comes through the door with a gun. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. More infringements are not solutions, just as past ones have not been solutions. Bad people will continue to get guns just as they always have. They don't get permits, they don't check in, they don't follow the laws. Only the good people follow the laws. Familial breakdown is something that we need to look at in terms of mass violence. As of last month, 26 of CNN's 27 deadliest mass shootings have involved someone from a fatherless home and fatherless household. We end up with broken boys.
All right, Erin.
Wow. Okay. So first I'll start with the mental health piece. About 20% of Americans have mental illness, and we find ways not to shoot each other every single day. Mental illness is not a thing that makes you violent towards other people. It often makes you harmful towards yourself. When we are talking about a good person with a gun versus a bad person with a gun, just this weekend, a good person with a gun in Illinois who stopped a shooter who came into a bar and had him pinned on the floor while law enforcement arrived. They came in, saw the guy with the gun, shot him, and killed him. The good guy with the gun died. Because law enforcement can't always discern in 2 seconds who is the good guy with the gun in this situation, who's the bad guy with the gun. The answer is to fund gun violence prevention research. It's to digitize records of gun sales. Right now, we have boxes and boxes of papers and papers of people who have applied for this. There's no time for people to run through all of these record hauls to check and make sure that this person can own a gun. We need to get our ATF into the 21st century. We need to have universal background checks. We need to disarm domestic abusers. Representative Drazkowski talked about mass shooters coming from fatherless homes. 9 out of 10 mass shooters commit intimate partner violence. Domestic abuse is one of the first and very most important indicators of someone who is likely to commit violence against other people. So these are solutions that we can put in place now that have proven to reduce intimate partner shootings, violence against law enforcement, mass shootings, violence against people and themselves, and suicides.
Thank you. We'll now have 5 minutes of panel discussion on this question, following the same format as described earlier. Our timers will signal to me as our time is used. And I'd like to ask the panelists to make your comments sufficiently brief so that you can have a discussion. Who'd like to start?
So I think we previously, Nancy and I, 2 years ago in a debate, talked a little bit about research into the issue of violence. And I'll repeat what I said then. I don't think anyone is opposed to research when it comes to gun violence. What we're opposed to is politically motivated research with a predetermined outcome. If we're not doing that, if we're doing scientific research in a refereed and appropriate, straightforward manner, I think we're all in favor of that.
Did you support our bill
No,
last year?
Well, so the bill here, I think you've not necessarily represented accurately. The bill was, what's prohibited in Minnesota law is we regard as private data or a prohibition on collecting data about lawful gun ownership. We're not okay with collecting data on that or providing that to be collected by the Minnesota Department of Health or the Department of Public Safety or anyone else.
You can't study guns and gun violence without studying lawful gun ownership. And all the bill would have done is set a comma and said, except for the purpose of public health research, which would be de-identified. There would be no possibility that that bill could be used to somehow create some kind of a registration of legal gun owners. And I think it's important that if you're really saying that you support public health research, it would be really great then if the Minnesota Gun Owners Caucus would support us in that bill this year, because we need to be able to do research in Minnesota. I also want to just very briefly respond to this idea that gun laws have never done anything. Not a single person in this room is afraid that they're going to get shot up by a machine gun. And that's because since 1934 we've had the National Firearms Act in place, and we do not have a problem with fully automatic weapons in this country anymore, even though we did back in the 20s and the 30s in St. Paul. Lots of times people talk about how poor the assault weapons ban was. Oh, it was so unsuccessful. Well, here's something about this unsuccessful assault weapons ban. Compared to the 10-year period before the ban, the number of gun massacres during the ban fell by 37%, and the number of people dying from gun massacres fell by 43%. After the ban lapsed, there was an 183% increase in gun massacres and a 239% increase in massacre deaths. I actually think that's very successful.
Are there other comments?
The only thing I have to say is to my fellow colleague, State Representative Drazkowski, please do not make arguments saying we shouldn't pass this law because only good people will follow this law and bad people won't. That is just an argument against all laws. We've made heroin illegal and people still made use of that, and we make driving 65 miles an hour up 35E up to St. Paul illegal, and people manage to do that. There are going to be people who break laws, but most people are law-abiding citizens, and laws in place do reduce gun violence. We have seen that in literally every other country in the world, and we have seen those results bear out in other states in our nation. Unfortunately, weak laws state to state, so Illinois and Indiana would be a really good example of having different laws by states and having different gun violence outcomes. But not putting a law in place because some people might not abide by it is a terrible look for a state representative.
Well, I will offer that in a gun-free zone, the law-abiding people follow the law. They don't bring their gun here. I didn't bring my gun. Many other people didn't bring their gun here tonight because we respect what this building put up and said. They wouldn't want a firearm here, right? The law-abiding people follow the law. Now, in the gun-free zones, you see that happen throughout the country. The law-abiding people follow the law, and bad people come through the door with bad intent and do harm unto others. And what is the first thing that they do when that happens? They call Dave and guys like him with a gun, and they say, get over here. Now, Dave's maybe 30 minutes away, so they can do all kinds of more ravaging behavior on the poor, defenseless people when they're there until Dave gets there. But Dave's the guy they call.
I would just like to quickly say that in the Dallas sniper shooting, there were 20 fully armed Second Amendment protesters there, and when the shooting started, they had to do what everyone else did, run and hide. And in doing that, they created huge confusion, and they caused law enforcement to actually take a lot longer to find the actual perpetrator. Having a lot of guns around during a mass shooting is not helpful.
That's a silly comment because You know, if they're are they going to sit there like ducks on a pond, or are they going to run and hide? I give them credit for doing what they instinctively should do to save their lives. Let's look at instead at some things that we can actually agree on, as was mentioned earlier. Let's do things to address this culture of life that we have a problem with video games and movies, that you're rewarded for finishing the guy off in the video game. Folks, there's a problem. We can agree on things like that. Let's look at things that keep kids in touch with their fathers so that they actually learn the boundaries of operating within the culture and society.
Thank you. Let's move on to question number 3 now. And the first to respond on this question will be Erin. How do the proposed solutions affect Second Amendment rights? For example, an ordinary law-abiding gun owner's rights versus a violent offender's rights. Your answer could address, but is not limited to, conceal and carry, defense, and hunting.
So the short answer is they don't. Background checks on all gun sales do not infringe law-abiding gun owners' right to own a gun. Red flag laws do not infringe on a law-abiding gun owner's right to have a gun. Extreme risk protective orders do not impose on a law-abiding gun owner's right to have a gun. These are measures to keep people safe and to keep gun owners safe. So, you know, long and short answer, they don't.
Right. Steve.
The Second Amendment, the question talks about hunting. The Second Amendment's not about hunting. It was written to guarantee their free people the ability to defend themselves and their families from the threat of the development of oppressive government. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Nearly all the proposals from Democrats have focused on infringing upon even more of the Second Amendment rights, as they have focused on guns rather than focusing on the problem. Not a single one of these proposals will help the problem. Harder for good people to own guns, for sure. Just as easy for law-breaking bad guys to continue to get guns. The bad guys and gals will have guns, and the good guys and gals will not. Many of these ideas will actually help the problem. But not violate the Second Amendment. Let's focus on addressing mental health issues in our culture, because that's the majority of the problem for the suicides and many of the homicides. Let's do what we can to strengthen families, to encourage two-parent households over fatherless homes. We talked about broken boys earlier and the mass shootings and what comes of them. Training youth in firearm safety. Who can be opposed to that? That's something we can bipartisanly agree on. Joint physical custody. We passed it earlier in the House in 2011. Kentucky has passed that into law to keep fathers in touch with their kids into adulthood. Those are some things we can agree on. Let's look at our use of psychotropic drugs and the effect that they have on kids around suicidal thoughts and others.
Nancy.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we managed to cut the rate of motor vehicle deaths in this country by 90% without confiscating cars. Most of the legislative solutions that protect Minnesota champions, like expanding permit to purchase for all gun sales, extreme risk protection orders, freeing the Minnesota Department of Health to collect data for research, raising the minimum age to purchase or possess a military-style assault weapon to 21, and mandatory lost and stolen firearms reporting, none of those have any negative impact upon responsible, law-abiding gun owners. That's why the majority of hunters and other gun owners support strengthening our gun laws in Minnesota, because they respect the fact that the words well-regulated are baked right into the Second Amendment. That being said, compromise is part of the price we pay as citizens. As Justice Scalia wrote in the 2008 Heller v. D.C. decision, like all rights, the right protected by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. The First Amendment guarantees us the right of freedom of religion, but a Muslim woman in Minnesota cannot wear a burqa in her driver's license photo. We're guaranteed the right of free speech, but we can't yell bomb in an airport. And don't get me started on TSA and search and siege and in inappropriate searches at the airport, right? So we have to be able to find a balance between what is an individual right and what is good for the community and public safety.
Thank you. Bryan.
So in terms of the Second Amendment right for an individual in the United States, the courts have made it quite clear that the Second Amendment protects an individual, not a collective right, to keep and bear arms specifically for the purpose of self-defense, not for hunting, not for recreation, the purposes of self-defense. And as Nancy said, the court also held that right, like all other rights, they're not absolute. And that's the great question of litigation around gun rights and gun control legislation right now. We don't really know what that means because the court hasn't gone back and ruled on this at the U.S. Supreme Court level. We don't know what level of scrutiny would be applied to a law prohibiting or that infringes upon the Second Amendment right through legislation. So right now I think we don't necessarily know that answer, but I think there's a lot of uncovered legal ground here, but I'll draw a parallel. The Second Amendment comes right after the First Amendment, and the courts have held that the First Amendment should be held to strict scrutiny, meaning that only in exceptional circumstances are we going to allow government to infringe upon that right for the community or community safety or other purposes. So I hear a lot about how the Second Amendment was written in the time of a musket, so it only should apply to muskets and similar weapons. But we apply the First Amendment to modern instruments of speech, the internet, computers, Twitter, although hopefully not so much for the president. We shouldn't require permits or fees. We don't require permits or fees to exercise your First Amendment right to speak. We shouldn't do the same for the Second Amendment. We shouldn't require permits in order to exercise your right to free speech. You shouldn't have to have a permit to own and carry a firearm. Thank you.
All right, we'll now have 5 minutes of panel discussion on this question. Who would like to start? And again, please keep your comments brief so that we can have a discussion.
So I just want to respond to one thing. The continued talk of fatherless homes. So the child that my wife and I have will come from a fatherless home. They will have two mothers. And I don't think anything about having two mothers or a single mother or two dads or anything like that has anything to do with someone's inclination to be more violent. And so I don't think bringing in single parent homes or two mom whatever homes is particularly helpful. But I think what I want to get back to is talking about the statistics. We heard from Sergeant Powers about the process through which one goes through if they decide to do the permit to purchase or a permit to carry. But if they don't go through that, if they do a private person-to-person sale, if I said, hey, I have $200, can you give me your gun? And you say, hey, that sounds great. She doesn't know me. She doesn't know if I can own a gun. In states that have passed universal background checks, we have seen 40% reduction in gun homicide, a 15% reduction in gun suicide rate, 53% law enforcement killed in the line of duty, 47% fewer women shot to death by intimate partners, and 47% lower firearm suicide, and it also reduces firearm trafficking between states. Background checks on all gun sales. Something supported by 90% of Minnesotans that has proven to reduce gun deaths, whether it's homicide or suicide. These are things that we can do in the state. And so I guess my question to my panelists would be, why is going through a background check infringing on your right to own a gun?
You will see that, and you saw in the presentation, Representative, that the gun control measures we've had in the past, which include background checks, have not increased or have not improved the efficacy or the reduction, brought about a reduction of suicide or homicide. Each of those, there were like 5 of them on the screen, and it's very clear. So I don't know where your statistics come from, but if we're going to do something, let's do something that's going to actually address the problem. That is why do people use some instrument, some method to either kill themselves or others? That's what we need to focus on. What is going on in our culture? We have the use of psychotropic drugs that turn into, you hear the commercial on the TV, this could cause depression, anxiety, or suicidal thoughts. Okay? Has anybody ever thought about that?
Yes.
And we're using it more and more and more as a substitution for parenting in our culture.
Representative, the reason why it can increase suicidal thoughts is because when someone has severe depression and they get very depressed, the first thing that returns when they start taking that medication is energy before the depression kind of writes itself in the brain. That's why it increases that, not because it increases someone's inclination to think suicidally.
I'd like to say a couple of things. One, you brought up video games, and I'm not a fan of violent video games by any means, but I will tell you this, the country in the world that has the highest rate of people who play violent video games is Japan. It has one of the lowest rates of gun death. So you really have got to look at, say, okay, what effect are those laws in Japan having then if you believe that violent video games are what's making people so deadly in the United States? But more than that, I want to say that the the studies that she pulled up seemed odd to me. And when I looked at them, and they did seem odd to me, when I looked at them, I realized that they were looking for one particular law that they could say did it all. So I want you to envision if we were driving and we only had one driving law. Maybe it's just the speed limit. We don't have to stop at red lights. We don't have to stop at stop signs. We don't have to do anything else. We just have to follow the speed limit. You don't need a license. You don't need seat belts. Can you imagine that then the speed limit would look like it's effective? No, it wouldn't. We have a network of laws and regulations, and when we follow them, we get here safely. We all drove here in a lethal weapon tonight. We're all going to get home safely, even though we're going to drive home in a lethal weapon, because we have this network of laws. And yes, not everyone follows every law all the time, but we wouldn't throw out all of our laws for around traffic because not everyone's going to follow them.
It's interesting you talk about a network of laws, because I had this thought about the state of California, which has universal background checks, a state license for gun owners, bans assault weapons, bans 50 caliber rifles, bans the sale, transfer, manufacture, and possession of high-capacity magazines, requires a safety class in order to own a firearm, only lets you buy one handgun a month, prohibits the sale of firearms not previously approved by the government, has discretionary concealed carry permitting, 10-day waiting period on firearm sales, a state database of all firearm sales, local governments can regulate firearms, and they have red flag restraining orders. Their criminal homicide rate by firearm in 2017, according to the FBI, is 3 times that of Minnesota.
And they're next to Nevada and Arizona, which is why we need federal anti-trafficking laws.
Thank you. All right, now for our final prepared question. The question is this, and the first to respond will be Steve. What role should or does public opinion play with regard to solving issues of gun violence?
Public opinion plays a large role, as most decisions that involve the government are political ones. We need to be responsible in educating people about the truth rather than using fear to motivate them toward proposals that will both degrade our Constitution and yield no results, or even be counterproductive. The problem lies in criminals and insane people. That needs to be the focus of the public discussion. Criminals don't follow the laws we have now. They won't follow additional laws either. Here I've got a compendium of a summary of the federal laws we have. It's like 12 pages long. I was going to print out the one for our state. It's 120 pages. That's just a summary of the laws we have. And so if criminals aren't going to follow the laws we have now, how are passing additional ones going to be helpful for us to turn their suicidal or their, in this case, homicide behavior, criminal behavior? Many insane people don't have the capacity to follow many of our laws, don't understand right and wrong, and will not change their behavior because of new laws. Law-abiding, sane people are the group that will be affected by additional laws infringing upon the Second Amendment. Our people will lose their freedom, and the problems will continue on a steady course. Hoplophobia is real. Fear of firearms or fear of armed citizens, and is propagated and stoked by the left. We have to stop focusing on hoplophobia and instead focus on what will solve the problem.
Thank you, Bryan.
Well, I'm of a couple minds on this question. I think when it comes to polls, it's true we've seen polls that show widespread support for certain legislation, but I don't think that holds true when we get to the actual votes. Nevada, which had a referendum on universal background checks, was polling in the 85 to 90% range, which pretty much reflects what we've seen in Minnesota the last 2 years. But when the referendum came to vote, it passed 50.45 to 49.55. So I'm not sure if the support, a lot of the support in a poll depends on how the poll is worded. The Minnesota poll, the Star Tribune poll that showed this year 90% of Minnesotans supporting background checks used the wording, do you believe that a criminal background check should be performed on every gun sale? Which, by the way, is not even an accurate description of what the proposed legislation was. But when we polled the same thing using the actual provisions of the law, there was widespread opposition from gun owners. So I think polling's important. I think polling can take a pulse of some things. Polling depends a lot on the wording and the polling methodology to really get to the right answer. In the end, as Steve said, passing or not passing a law is a political question, and that's one that I hope all of you engage with your representatives on and express your point of view. I think usually widespread popular issues are passed into law, but even the ones that seem obvious, like Sunday liquor sales, or at least to me, take a long time to come into law. Remember that at the end of this, we're talking about a specific enumerated constitutional right. There will sure to be litigation that follows the passage of any gun control laws in Minnesota or other states, and that will take time to play out in the courts.
Erin.
So I think public opinion should play a role. As a representative of the 39,500 constituents in my district, it is important what they think and what they believe and what they want as their representative. It's part of why I did the sit-in. I think it's important to note that support from a state versus support from people who show up to vote are always very different. And so when you look at the kind of polling we have in our state and in our nation, between 85 and 90% of folks support background checks on all gun sales. Not all of those folks are going to be able to be voters. But I want to answer Representative Drazkowski's question. He said, how is it possible that background checks and red flag laws could help? And here is how. People who are dangerous to themselves or others usually show signs beforehand. The Parkland shooter was a great example. There were numerous calls made to the local FBI and police department about this child, but they had no tool to go in and remove guns from someone they knew could be dangerous. That is a way that it could help. Background checks on all gun sales, not 85% of gun sales, but all gun sales could help. Will it end all gun violence? Absolutely not. But I do not want to be reading stories anymore of someone who survived the mass shooting in Las Vegas only to die in the mass shooting in Texas. We're having repeat mass shooter survivors now. We can do something to help. We should do something to help. And public opinion says we should. Representatives should follow their lead.
Nancy.
We don't take a poll to determine if gravity exists or if the Earth is round. We teach science and help Americans learn that gravity exists and that the Earth is round. At Protect Minnesota, we consider this to be a big part of our job, to teach Minnesotans to understand gun violence scientifically as a public health issue with public health solutions. Our challenge is the decades of misinformation that has been put out there by the gun lobby and reinforced by American culture. We're not a hunting nation anymore. The majority of gun owners now purchase guns for personal protection. They didn't grow up learning about gun safety at their grandpa's knee. They don't take gun safety courses so that they can get their hunting license. You don't need 1 minute of gun safety training to buy a handgun in Minnesota. So you bring the gun home, the NRA tells you need to keep it loaded and close to protect your family. The media tells you that all you need to know about how to shoot this gun is what you can learn from watching Die Hard. That is the biggest challenge that we face when it comes to public opinion. Americans have bought the lie that having guns makes us safer, which is why the youth movement has been so exciting and important. Growing up having to practice getting shot at in school has helped our students to understand what we oldsters have forgotten, that guns are inherently dangerous, and that is where these discussions have to start.
All right, thank you. Again, we'll have 5 minutes of panel discussion on this question, and the timers will signal me as our time is used. So who would...
I want to jump in. I'm sorry. I just need to talk to the representative and say that every time you say the term insane people, you are doing a huge disservice to a big percentage of Americans who live with mental illness. And I think also you're making this idea that somehow it's these insane people running around killing people. Well, here's the deal. In interpersonal gun violence, when I shoot someone else, mental illness is a factor 4% of the time. The gun is a factor 100% of the time. And so it's terribly important that we stop stigmatizing those who live with mental illness, who are much more likely to be victims of gun violence than to ever perpetrate it. We have got to start recognizing that, that this room is full of people who live with mental illness and who are completely safe. And so for you to make it sound like it's insane people doing all the shooting is really, truly offensive.
Excuse me one moment. I would just like to ask that nobody interrupt anybody else as we're proceeding forward with this. And also, I would like to ask the audience to not clap, not boo, not laugh, whatever. Just wait until this program's over. So, okay, let's go ahead.
Can I go?
Yes, you may.
Yeah, I think maybe you want to listen a little closer to what I had to say. I was talking about suicides.
You said insane.
I was talking about suicides and people with mental health problems who get insane to the point that they commit suicide. Now that's insanity. We're talking about suicides and we're talking about homicides. I was not talking about insane people committing homicides. I was talking about both homicides and suicides. I'd appreciate if you would listen a little closer. The question about red flag laws. I just read recently that Maryland now has experienced the first situation where a police officer goes in the home in response to a red flag law and tries to extricate a gun from someone without an announcement, and there was a struggle, and the police officers killed the individual in the home. So are we going to go with more and more laws that that get to the point now where government becomes one of the statistics on the sheet of how many people are killed? I hope we don't go that direction. Folks, 100 years ago, we had many more guns per capita than we do today. Many, many more. We didn't have any of the mass shooting incidences that we have today. We have a culture problem in our society, and if we stick our heads in the sand and deny that, we're doing disservice to every person who is injured with a gun in the future, with a car, with a knife, with chemicals, with suffocation, with any form of suicide or homicide behavior. We're doing a disservice if we don't focus on the problem and we instead continue to fixate on our fear of guns. And that's what we're seeing happen here with part of this discussion. I hope that we can focus on the solutions and come to an agreement on what both sides can agree are solutions to reducing homicides and reducing suicides.
Bryan, Erin, does either of you have a comment?
I'll be brief, and I certainly don't speak for the National Rifle Association, or they always speak for me. But as an NRA instructor who has taught home firearm safety and personal protection in the home, there's not an NRA course that says you should keep a firearm loaded and near you at all times. In fact, the courses talk specifically about the responsibility of being a responsible gun owner, about how to store your firearm safety, about your decision whether or not to carry a firearm, and then sends you to the appropriate state course. In Minnesota, it would be a class from a permit to carry instructor on how to do that. I don't know of any gun rights organization that says you should keep a loaded firearm near you at all times and pushes that on the population.
So the thing, I'll say a few things. I usually wouldn't get down in the rabbit hole about mental illness, but I feel like it can't go unaddressed. So insane people aren't people who attempt to complete suicide. People with depression do, people with anxiety do, people who are in a desperate situation, but they're not insane. They're hurting, and it's a hard situation. When we talk about the entirety of gun violence, when we're talking about the entire situation, we cannot ignore that of all the other things that have been listed, knives and cars and all of those things, there are other purposes for those things. There is one purpose for a gun, and it is to kill a thing. And so when we are talking about an instrument that is used solely to kill, that is it. We should take the most care to make sure that the people who have those guns are allowed legally to have those guns and are able to operate those guns. That is not hard. The culture problem you're speaking of is uniquely American. There is no more mental illness in America than there is in the rest of the nation. There's no more fatherless homes than there are in the rest of the world. There are no more video games played in the United States than anywhere else in the world. We have a gun problem, and that is why we have gun violence. I'm not saying guns are the problem. Guns are a problem here. This is why gun violence is a problem, and it is uniquely American. It is uniquely solvable with our work together, but we are not afraid of guns.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Next, we'll move to questions from the community, as submitted to us via email in advance of the forum and by tonight's live audience. For this section, panelists will have 1 minute to respond, and panelists will respond in order directed by me. If a question is posed to one specific panelist, the remaining panelists will have the option to respond for a minute, again in the order determined by me. Our timekeepers will signal the speaker with 30 seconds remaining, 15 seconds remaining, and then when it's time to stop. So let's begin. The first question and the first person to respond will be Nancy. Excuse me. I believe Sergeant Powers is coming back up.
Oh.
And as I understand it, Sergeant Powers will comment as he chooses as we go through these community questions. All right, the first question is, do more guns make us safer? Why or why not? You have 60 seconds.
Every reputable public health study that has been peer-reviewed has shown that more guns do not make us safer. And so it's really important that we understand that guns have an important purpose in our culture, but making us safer is not generally a part of that. More guns make us a lot less safe from the point of view of, for instance, law enforcement, where there's an arms race going on, and sadly law enforcement may be losing that. More guns make us much less safe at home. A gun in your home means that you are 2 times more likely to experience a homicide in that home and 3 times more likely to experience a suicide in that home. A woman who lives in a home with a gun is 5 times more likely to be killed by her partner. And so in no metrics are we seeing that guns make us safer.
Erin?
So, amen. That is true. We have a gun violence rate that is 25 times higher than other developed countries. Similarly, we know that children often shoot parents in the home because of unsecured guns. There was a dog who shot their own owner this week because of a loaded unsecured gun. The number of guns does directly correlate to gun violence. And so the United States has more guns than any other nation, and therefore we have a higher rate of gun violence than any other nation in the world.
Steve?
As I mentioned, over time, the number of guns per capita has decreased in our country. So we had more guns 100 years ago per capita than we have today. The violent crime rate was much lower than it was today. There weren't any of these mass shootings then. We're seeing more of them, especially in the mass shootings in the last 20 years. But in addition to that, we continue to see that the violent crime rate is going down, and I think we need to acknowledge that. In the U.S. and in Minnesota. You saw the charts that were in front of us. We need to do what we can to continue to accelerate the decline in those, and that starts by focusing on the problems, not on fear of guns or any other reality that we have in our culture.
Bryan?
I think in brief, I would say there are more firearms owned today in civilian hands than at any point in our history. And we are at a 50-year low in violent crime involving firearms. I think the data is pretty clear.
All right, the next question is this. Justice Scalia offered the belief in the Heller case that, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. And that's in quotes. Do you agree? And the first panelist will be Bryan.
So the question, and I'm sorry, I didn't hear the very beginning, but that was you're quoting.
Do you agree with Justice Scalia's statement in the Heller case that, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited, close quote. It is, quote, not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose, period, close quote.
So my philosophical answer is no, I would disagree, but I'm a realist. So the realistic answer is this is what the court has ruled. This is what we have to, address as we think about legislation. So the real question here behind all of this is what level of scrutiny gets applied to firearms regulations. And in my mind, the Second Amendment is the same as the First, the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, and the list goes on. So we should apply strict scrutiny, which means that any regulation must be rooted in fact, and any regulation must be the exceptional case where government's interest overrides the individual right. That should be a very rare circumstance. I believe Scalia goes on to describe longstanding historical prohibitions like individuals who have been convicted of certain crimes, certain sensitive places, et cetera. I don't remember off the top of my head how he worded it, but I think that was the gist of what he was after.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I'm certainly not a Supreme Court justice, and I haven't read every part of Heller, but it did give the individual right over collective right, and I think that's an important distinction and really has changed the trajectory of the discussion about firearms and the Second Amendment in our country. And the part of the Second Amendment that I like most is the period after the word infringed.
Nancy.
Well, I totally and completely agree. As I said, I'm a big supporter of the Second Amendment, especially that well-regulated part. I think we should remember that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution comes out of the preamble of the Constitution, which says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States." So that preamble is the birthplace of our Bill of Rights, and everything in our Bill of Rights has to feed into that idea of what's good for the whole.
Erin.
I do agree. One of the weirdest moments that I had as a state representative was on the floor, and I said the words, "The Constitution is a living, breathing document," and everyone on the other side of the aisle reacted very loudly. And after I finished, I sat down and I looked at my colleague. I said, "Did I say a weird word?" And he goes, "No, they just don't think the Constitution should change." And I thought to myself, that is very interesting, because our court constantly interprets our Constitution as we evolve as humans. So if today gun ownership looks like it does, but if in 100 years gun ownership looks very, very different as technology advances, I would really hope that our Constitution scholars and our courts would continue to interpret our laws to keep us safe and to keep our rights upheld. So I agree with the Heller decision and the way that it was framed there, knowing that as the future unfolds and as we unfold as a society and as a nation, our Constitution should continue to wrap its arms around what we continue to develop.
Thank you. The next question will go first to Erin. And here it is. How can gun owners be assured that universal checks are not a first step to gun confiscation?
That is a really great question, and my answer would be pretty simple. If 85% of gun sales currently in Minnesota go through background checks and have not led to 85% gun confiscation, I would argue 100% guns going through background checks would not lead to 100% gun confiscation. So often we get into this theoretical thing as if the military is coming for my X, Y, or Z, as if they don't have nuclear weapons or tanks. But we know that this constitutional right was set for Americans to protect and defend themselves, and that will be upheld no matter what kind of background checks we have, whether it's 85% or 100% of Minnesotans, hopefully Americans.
Nancy?
50% of Americans now live in states that they have passed universal background checks, and those states have not led to universal gun confiscation. We've seen this play before. We've had an opportunity to see how other states are dealing with this. These have been held up in court, and they are not causing problems for gun owners in those states. I think it's really interesting how those groups that are most wanting to talk about the Second Amendment don't believe that it will actually protect them, right? We have the Second Amendment in place. And so if laws are passed that are onerous and that take away the right of law-abiding Americans to have and keep guns, those laws will be thrown out because we have a Second Amendment. So if you have a Second Amendment, we should be able to relax about that a little bit and start saying what will actually keep Americans safer.
Bryan?
Yeah, I'm definitely not a member of the tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy club on the gun confiscation issue. But I think it's important to be honest about this, that we have had states that have used the records kept by federal firearms licenses in order to mail letters and ensure that individuals turned in firearms that were no longer allowed to be owned in that state. That happened in Connecticut, it happened in New York, it happened in Massachusetts earlier this year around bump stocks. I realize not a firearm, but an accessory. So this does happen from that standpoint, that these records wind up being used for other purposes, and particularly if they're going to be digitized, as I believe Representative Maye Quade would like to see.
Steve?
Well, the steps, the progression naturally goes, first you register everybody, and then when you're registered, then you have full registration, and confiscation can only happen after that. So one of the protections against confiscation is to not require registration for people and family members who exchange guns, sell guns to each other, some of the freedoms that we still have that doesn't completely close the loop. And I found it interesting to hear our colleagues on the other end of the table suggest that, well, let us get to that point and then the Second Amendment will protect us. The way legislation works is it works incrementally over time, over years, over decades, over lifetimes. And they will get the registration complete, and then they'll work on the next elements, and then they'll start to work towards confiscation, one increment at a time, just like a clock, and that's how it works.
Thank you. Okay, the next question will go first to Steve. Do you support hardening all houses of worship, K-12 schools, and post-secondary schools to ensure safety?
I think we need to have a discussion on some approaches that will help protect those places from these mass shooting events. Hardening is definitely certainly an option. Looking at not only hardening the facilities and making access more restricted in places where it needs to be. I mean, I can think of schools in my district. I talked to some of the kids, and I've been into some of the schools, and gosh, there's 4 or 5 doors into some of the schools in our district, and you know, there's that. There's maybe having police officers, and I know the teachers union is very opposed to having guns in schools, but you know, there's military people and retired cops and others that work for many of our schools. We already have a piece in law that allows people to carry firearms in schools, and I think we need to look at some of those solutions. Very effective at deterrence.
Erin.
No. I don't want to go to church with armed guards. I don't want students to have to go to the schools that I went to with armed teachers. Oftentimes that would ask a teacher to shoot their own student, because oftentimes shooters in schools are students. The answer isn't to put more guns in communities. That's a sale for more guns. That is a sale from gun manufacturers to sell you more guns. We need less guns. We need to make sure that the people who have guns are allowed to have guns, that the people who have guns are safe. So the answer is not to put bulletproof glasses in schools and then arm the doors and close every other door off, because guess what? We all managed to go through school without mass shootings in our schools. What we do have now are people who shouldn't have guns that have guns and can obtain them very easily and then enter into places and shoot and kill people. So no, I don't want to go to school or worship in a jail. I'd like to go to school and worship in a school and a church. We should keep it that way.
Bryan.
Well, I think in the end, choosing the security measures that a K through 12 school or a college or a house of worship should have is a local decision. And certainly a house of worship which is not part of government, it's the parish's decision to make that choice. I think the same, and again, I think those should be prudent, risk-based decisions made in consultation with people who are experts in that field. Maybe you want armed security, maybe you don't. I don't know the right answer there because I don't know the location that we're talking about. But I think it's a local decision for schools. I think it's up to the parish or the parish school if we're talking about a religious school. I do think there's value in threat assessment teams at the K through 12 level and in colleges, and I hope that the legislature brings that legislation back in the coming year. That was vetoed by Governor Dayton as a part of a larger bill. There's great value in that. It's been effective in other states, and it has nothing to do with guns or gun control.
Nancy.
Just a couple of things there. Bryan, I know that you've talked about being a volunteer, but I do think for full disclosure, we should point out that you have a threat assessment company that when there are, that in particular, you teach organizations, businesses, schools, how to deal with mass shootings and the fear of mass shootings. So I do think for full disclosure, we should get that out there. Armed guards and police officers were present at many mass shootings: Columbine, Virginia Tech, Fort Hood, Pulse, Las Vegas, Parkland, Santa Fe, Texas. They didn't stop it. The overwhelming majority of people who are perpetuating mass shootings are suicidal. They're going in to get killed. And in fact, that's one reason if you go to your bank nowadays, you're not very likely to see armed guards at banks anymore, because FBI bank robbery data has showed that if they have armed guards, there's much more likely to be violence taking place at the bank, as opposed to if they have unarmed guards. And so we got to stop thinking about the fact that somehow more guns are going to make us safer, and we have to think about how do we make people safer in our schools.
Thank you. Okay, next we'll start with Erin. And here's the question. Should anything be done to better enforce current gun laws? If so, what do you propose?
I only have a minute. Okay, so we could extend background checks that 85% of Minnesotans go through to purchase their gun to 100% of Minnesotans. We could put money and enforcement in a 2014 law that said we have is it gun violence protective orders when you are convicted of domestic abuse? Yes, and then there is a law that says they can take the gun, but there was never enforcement or directives given to courts or law enforcement on how they should take the gun, where they should store the gun, how long the gun should be taken for, and when it should be given back. So that is a very weak law that we could enforce and make stronger. And then we could put in red flag laws that could be enforced much more forcefully in Minnesota.
Bryan?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that we can do with existing Minnesota law. I won't repeat the domestic violence one. I think Erin covered that quite well, and we talked about that particular issue earlier. I'll highlight this issue. There's an under-sentencing problem in Minnesota with individuals found, a prohibited person found in possession of a firearm or ammunition. That's a felony under Minnesota and federal law. They can be prosecuted in both jurisdictions because they're separate. It's a separate criminal statute. NPR had a story, I believe back in 2015 in the first round of kind of looking at how do we change Minnesota's sentencing, that this was the single most dropped and under-sentenced charged in Minnesota. These are folks who are going to be violent. They have one of the highest recidivism rates, and they're one of the most prone populations of individuals to commit crime. Let's not under-sentence them. The law calls for 5 years state, 5 years federal. Let's use it.
Steve?
I don't have a lot to add here, Mary. I think we just need to figure out if there are areas in our law, especially those dealing with dangerous people, where the law is not being properly enforced, and make certain we do. That would mean getting people together, kind of the criminal justice area.
Okay. Nancy?
I'm actually going to completely agree with Bryan on this and on his general take on criminal justice reform. There's a lot we need to do, and he's exactly right on many of the things that he's named. We do have to keep in mind, though, that we're never going to be able to truly arrest our way out of the gun violence problem, and particularly when we're talking about urban gun violence. We also have to put programs in place. We have to provide state funding for programs like Project Life in Minneapolis, where they're intervening in young people's lives before or when they're at the risk of becoming the most dangerous, and engaging them with wraparound services and things like that. We have to, yes, we need the carrot, yes, we need the stick, but we also need the carrot. We also have to care about the people and recognize that anyone who picks up a gun to shoot another person or themselves is not having a good day, and probably could use our help.
All right, this will be the last question, and it will go first to Nancy. Do you think the media sensationalizes gun violence? And if you do think that, how?
The media makes it sound like we have a much bigger problem with mass shootings than we do, and it way underplays the serious problem we have, which is cheap handguns shooting lots of people all the time in an ongoing progression. We believe that we need to be so afraid of everywhere we go for mass shootings. And as Erin said, I mean, we've now had our first double dipping. We had people who survived one mass shooting who are now having to go through another. So I'm not saying mass shootings are not a problem. I'm saying that by sensationalizing mass shootings so much, we're ignoring the biggest part of the problem, which is ongoing suicides and ongoing homicides and unintentional that are usually taking place with really cheap handguns that are available because we have insufficient laws.
Erin?
I mean, I would agree with all of that. I would add that I think the media hasn't done a great job of talking about some of those everyday gun violence issues that happen in places where you would quote unquote expect it. And so, you know, when we talk about the news, these are things that are newsworthy in that they don't happen all the time, or they happen to a bunch of people once. And so we should keep that in mind when we talk about the news. It's meant to report on different things, not things that happen every day, like suicides in Minnesota. I also think we haven't really done a good job of looking at violent extremism in our nation and in our state. We have a serious self-radicalization problem that is going on in our country with neo-Nazis and white nationalists, and they have a lot of access to guns, and we are seeing that creep up. We saw that come up in a 2006 report with the FBI, and we have not addressed that, and the more we kind of let that go and the more we don't focus attention on it, the more we won't address it outright and hopefully quash it.
Steve?
Yes, absolutely. The media sensationalizes this, and you know, if you got people who have mental health issues, people that are thinking about trying to hurt somebody, the copycat type behavior. I talked about the mass media around some of the video games earlier in some of the movies. I don't know if that qualifies in this category, but when you have video games that are as clear and lifelike that they make the video games nowadays, and the movies, and the motives, and the participatory way that people are involved in actually executing the behaviors that kill people in these movies and video games. You know, we're going to have to think as a culture about whether we want to be a culture of life or a culture of death, because that is not helping us, folks, and where we're going. And we have to, I mentioned earlier, strengthen the family so families can actually say, you know what, kids, this isn't for you.
Bryan?
So my complaint with the media used to be that news reports weren't accurate when talking about firearms, and I think we've solved that issue through a lot of outreach over the last couple of years. But I completely agree with the comments about the media in terms of sensationalizing some of these incidents. I think it does a disservice to folks that are survivors of day-to-day gun violence. I think we focus too much on the sensational event, on the larger events. I think we over-focus on the shooter. Although I've seen the media get better at this over the last several months. We're not naming the shooter as often. We're not, doing these hour-long exposés into who and what they are, because I think that makes them the hero of the incident. And I don't think any of us believe that that's true. I think that when you do promote the shooter and you're constantly naming them, I think that leads to social contagion, that it winds up with copycat incidents, because you have some individual who has that mindset that I want to be like that person because, look, they just got that hour-long special on MSNBC or what have you. So I'd like to see less sensationalized coverage, more fact-based coverage of day-to-day issues.
Thank you, panelists. It's now time for closing remarks. Each speaker will have 1 minute for brief closing remarks. The order of closing remarks will be determined by me, and will go in the reverse order of the order that we started. That is, we'll start with Erin, then Nancy, then Bryan, then Steve. A timekeeper will hold up signs to indicate when you have 30 seconds remaining, and when you have 15 seconds remaining, and when you must stop. So, let's begin with Erin. You have 1 minute.
Thank you. I think one piece that we didn't really touch on this evening, well, there's two. One is that we don't have a voice of a survivor up here. There are a lot of survivors of gun violence here in Minnesota that could have spoken truth about their experience and other people's experiences. And if we want to make change, we should also center the folks who are most affected to make that change and listen to what they say. And so I think that voice is missing here. But I think the last piece I want to bring up about gun violence in our nation is it's really motivated by the desire to sell more guns. Representative Drazkowski has rightfully brought up video games. In video games, you can purchase a real gun. In the video game, you purchase a kind of gun that exists in real life so you can see what it is and how it works, and that is a way to sell to kids. It makes them consumers before they're even legally able to buy guns. When we say we need more guns to combat gun violence, that's another way to sell folks guns. A lot of this is a way to make money for gun manufacturers, and we have all been brought into this very weird conversation that is about money for some folks and life or death for everybody else. And so as we continue to talk about this issue, we should not ignore the money motivation motivation that there is for gun manufacturers, we can end gun violence, and sensible legislation can do it.
Nancy?
I want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this and for my panelists. Thank you for this. I talk a lot about public health and I do a lot of data, but I think it's important that we remember that behind every data point are real human beings whose lives have been devastated by gun violence in this country, and at rates that are just make us an outlier with every other country. And I think it's interesting, I was on a panel with the congressman who's for Parkland, Florida, and someone asked him, what would other countries be doing? And he said, no other country in the world would sit back and allow civilians to kill each other with guns at this rate. No other country in the world. Honduras wouldn't let that happen. And so we are making a choice as Americans. We are choosing to be a country where gun violence can take 38,000 lives a year. We are choosing to be a country where another 80,000 Americans can suffer the ill effects of having been shot and the trauma that comes after that. We are making choices every single day, and I hope that we choose wisely.
Bryan?
Thanks again for hosting the forum and for having the four of us here, and I hope this has been educational for everyone. I think we're going to be entering into an interesting legislative session in January because we're going to have a divided legislature with a DFL-controlled House, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a new Republican governor, a different level of energy across all of that. And it's interesting to note, at least in my experience, that most of our gun rights legislation in Minnesota has passed when we've had divided government. Permit to carry law, Range Protection Act, legalization of suppressors all happened because there were DFL chief authors in one house or the other, and a DFL or Republican governor signed the legislation. So I think there's a unique opportunity here to walk away from the back and forth we've had today on gun control and focus on what are the issues that we can agree upon from a bipartisan basis, and bring forward solutions that will continue to drive down the rate of violence and suicide in Minnesota. Thank you.
Steve?
Thank you to Mary, Emily, and Officer Dave and others for helping us today through this and inviting us and bringing everybody here. I think we've had a great discussion. Folks, we need to focus on things that will actually address the problem. We need to focus on what are we going to do to decrease violence in our culture? What are we going to do to decrease people who want to kill themselves in our culture? 77% of gun method deaths in Minnesota are actually suicide. So we can't forget either of those two categories. Rather than focusing on hoplophobia, on fear of guns, let's work to increase firearm safety training for youth. Let's decrease violence in video games and movies. Work through things that are going to strengthen our families. And by the way, I have to mention before she flips that sign over there, my favorite oxymoron was mentioned earlier: unarmed guard. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank all of the panelists as well as the sergeant for participating in this panel. And I'll turn this back to Paula Sang-Clark for closing remarks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And now, you guys have been terrific. Thank you so much for honoring the request we made to sit and listen and learn and hear everybody's different perspectives here. Please join me in thanking Mary Rice for doing a great job of moderating. I just have a few closing comments and then we'll get you out of here. But on behalf of the League of Women Voters, again, I'd like to thank Nativity Episcopal Church for the use of their space, and specifically, he's not here now, but Jamie Manzi Moore, who helped us with all the technical things here, getting hooked into audio systems and that sort of thing. So we'd like to specifically call him out and thank him. We also want to thank Dave Helgeson and Andrew Olson, who have been our camera guys here today, and also Mike McEntee from Egan Television, because they loaned us the equipment and did some real quick training of our volunteers. Since it's a holiday for them, they weren't going to be here and be able to do it themselves. So we wanted to thank Mike McEntee and Egan TV for their help. Again, please give a round of applause to Dave and Andrew. I also need to thank our many volunteers. Events like this do not happen with a lot of people who step up to the challenge when I ask them to volunteer their time. So if you volunteered tonight, could you just stand so we could recognize you? Including our timekeepers who did a great job. They had a lot of work to do. Our question screeners, okay? I also want to give a special shout out to Emily Helgeson here in the front row and Andrew Olson, who's pulling, I don't know how many different hats he's worn tonight. But the two of them, Andrew is our advocacy program coordinator for the League of Women Voters Dakota County. Emily is a member and was our lead forum planner tonight. So please, the two of you, take a bow. Great job. I'd also like to thank all of our wonderful and informative speakers. Sergeant Powers, as well as our panelists up here, for not only agreeing to be here tonight, but for also so thoughtfully presenting their perspectives and hopefully advancing the discussion. If you haven't already done so, our panelists were invited to share information with you at tables located out in the registration area. We invite you to stop at their tables as you exit. Again, please join me in a warm round of applause for our speakers and panelists. And last but not least, finally, thank you to all of you, our live audience, as well as those people who will engage with us through video recording that took the time to engage with us on this very important public policy topic. We hope we achieved our goal of advancing the conversation. Please let us know how we did. Inside of your program, you had an evaluation form. It matters to us. We care. Please take the time to fill that out. We listen to your feedback. We review the feedback for anything that we can do differently in the future. There's a box on the registration table out there where we can collect completed forms. So with that concludes our forum. Thank you very much for attending. Drive safely, and good night.